contingent. You remember I said there were 4 contingents because they had to break the army up to get them over the portages. The rear one decided that they had had enough, and they turned around and went back to civilization. This occurred where the present day of Stratton is located, and they turned around and headed back down the river. On they went. They were battling very high water, as it was discussed in this film strip. And I'm going to tell you a second story about Arnold's gold. Washington had told Arnold that he was going to send a large supply of what's called hard currency, coinage as we call it. Hard currency of various denominations. How much gold was in that, nobody will ever know. And so 2 of the men who were on the expedition were from Vassarboro, and they were brothers, and they looked at the men who were coming up the river, and when the bateaus, there was a line of them of about 7 bateaus, and the top one got broadsided and rolled the rest of them behind them over like bowling balls. And in one of those bateaus was the keg of hard currency. So it got dumped there. And of course it was in flood stage, and these men were almost in the starvation stage at this point, so they couldn't stop and hunt around for it, so they had to keep going. So it left it in the river, and there's no way of retrieving it anyway with high water. The following summer, after the Hull boys, as they call them, returned to their home in Vassarboro, in May of that year, the 2 brothers disappeared. And you probably can guess where they went. I can say this to you without fear of having a wrath of some of their ancestors come at me after the election tonight, because there was a man who lived in Vassarboro, the name of Frank Getchell. I'm sorry, the Getchell brothers, not Hull brothers. And anyway, Mr. Getchell did a lot of research, and he found that one of the oddities of how they handled land transfers at that time, this is in the late 1970s and early 1780s and 1790s, long in that period of time, was that the method on the coinage, or what was used to transact the land transfers, was marked on these deeds. That's an oddity that is no longer done, but at that time it was. He went down to the Kennebec County Courthouse, and they were able to dig up all the land transactions at this time, and sure enough, all of a sudden the Getchell brothers started to buy up land, and a considerable amount of land over the next 10 to 20 years. His conclusion was that the boys had gone up during the low water in June and July, found the keg of hard currency, brought it home. Of course, nobody would tell about that, and so they used it carefully over a period of time to buy land. So the first government subsidy of people here in Maine came to be. So that's the second thing. The expedition then went on further north, and they finally reached the headwaters of the Kennebec River at what's called the chain of ponds. And it's a whole chain of ponds all interconnected, and that's why they call it that. And that's right at the foot of one of the 1,600-foot ridges that I mentioned to you earlier they had to cross. So over they went. Arnold sent back word to the men back down the line of march, telling them that the land ahead was just too difficult and he knew at that point the men were starving to death anyway. The chances of them lifting a 400-pound bateau was slim. So he said, leave the bateaus and other heavy equipment, and we will keep on going. Another point I wanted to mention at this point is that in the summer of 2017, we were able to, in conjunction with the Maine Historic Preservation Commission in Augusta, fund an archaeological dig, because we knew that a lot of weird things went on with the expedition at that point, with the abandonment of all the bateaus and other equipment. We told them about where we thought that they may find something. There was a crew of 6 trained archaeologists went up there and did a pretty thorough job, and they hit the jackpot. Yeah, what it was, and I explained this to Ed before we came over, that we found a cache of about 2,000 musket balls. And the significant part of the find is that the lead oxidizes like any metal, and the lead oxide had been leached downwards, and on the boards which held these, it was not in a keg, it was in a rectangular box, and they were able to determine that the wood was still pretty much intact because the lead oxide had preserved it just by accident. For that reason, we were able to determine the size of the rectangular box, and we knew that the flat cache weighed about 87 pounds, so it had to be carried by 2 men. So we knew the box, we knew how it would be carried. It would have on each end of it, we had a rope handle, and we'd slide a pole through the 2 ropes, and it would be then slinged between 2 men and carried along on a portage. The men had abandoned it. Now remember, this is a war, right? When do you know that men abandon their ammunition to keep them safe in a battle? So they had abandoned it because it was too heavy, A, and B, the men at that stage were entering the first serious stages of starvation. They climbed over the mountain, and after they climbed the mountain, they came to a place called the Beautiful Meadow. And some of you people who have read Arundel or other research, this will recognize that name. It's a big oak, an elm, almost like a park-like appearance. And the men opened up the barrels by the order of the chief officers there at the time, and decided to give about an equal amount to each soldier to carry. In other words, they no longer were going to communally cook themselves. They gave what they had left. And that amounted to about 2 pints of flour each. And at that point, there was about 400 to 500 men in that particular group where they made that division. Now, that was supposed to last them for another 10 to 12 days. Okay, so you can get an idea from that how desperate that they were at that point. They had to negotiate a huge swamp on the south end of Lake Megantic. They went around that. They started to descend. Its outlet is the Chaudière River, and they started to descend that. The Chaudière comes out onto the St. Lawrence just about 4 miles above the city, and so that was the route they had to take. And in this film strip you saw, they were down to boiling leather and chewing on that, and that's the only food they had. There were 3 men who escaped from the British the following summer, came back over that route, and they found a number of men who were just sitting up against trees, and of course they were just simply skeletons at that point, and in their uniforms. So there were men dying at that point because they had no food and they just ran out of gas, and as it was described by Duluth, the rest of the men just could not try to carry them because they had hard enough time carrying themselves, so they had to leave them and wherever they fell. At that point, Henry Dearborn who was a captain at that point, came down the Chaudière in a canoe that they had found, and he finally got racked up in the rapids, and they pulled him ashore, and he had his dog that he had brought all the way from New Hampshire with him. The men looked at the dog and looked at him, and they finally said, "We're starving and we need that meat." and they'd kill the dog on the spot. But they were nice enough to offer him the first bite if they wanted it. But all of these illustrations I'm giving you, I'm trying to get across to you that this was a desperate point in the men. We're talking about 600 men that were left at that point. They were able to finally reach the first of the Canadian settlements and purchase enough food to keep them going. And they continued the descent down the river to the St. Lawrence. They had to zone around 2 British frigates that were out in the St. Lawrence at that point. They got enough men across there, and they started the siege of Quebec City. Now remember, Quebec City, even at that point, as well after the French and Indian Wars, was a virtual citadel. It had huge stone walls, 15, 20 feet high, and without artillery. Of course, they brought no artillery on the expedition. A siege of the city was almost impossible. So they just simply had to surround the town and try to cut off the supplies and hope for the best. About that time, about 2 weeks later, General Montgomery, with the troops that had come over the other way through the Champlain Valley, caught up with them, and they had at that time about 1,100 men total on the American side to try to storm that. They did that on the night of December 31st / January 1st. As it said in the film strip, that Arnold was shot in the leg, and he was taken off the field of battle, and General Montgomery was killed by a cannon blast on the opposite side of the city, and he died. So they essentially were leaderless, and as a result of that, many of the men were captured at that point. That's roughly the outline of what happened on that trip. It was a trip of very brave men, and men who later would become very important people in establishing our new country at that point. The experience they'd had there was like nothing most men ever have, or women for that matter, have to experience, and it left an impression on them. And these men were tough after that, and these men were later on, the British had to pay a big price. For instance, both Dearborn and Morgan were commanded regiments of riflemen at the Battle of Saratoga, which is listed as one of the world's 15 most decisive battles because it gave American wherewithal because they won there. That was also Benedict Arnold was the general at that moment in the field. So they had to pay for making these men into really tough men. That's about what I'd like to tell you. The other thing that is interesting is that I have taught history off and on. At least I like to picture myself as a history teacher. But I found that one of the things that is the best part of being able to understand this history, and which is a part of all your heritages as well as mine, is to go over the route, same route. And this is the commercial break. This is the book I had decided to write as a means of trying to transfer what these men did. It's a combination guidebook and history. And it's the history is in one column, the guidebook's in the next. My daughter did the front cover, and it's well illustrated, as you can see in the back. And my wife did most of the photography in there. But it's a really good book. But the trick is, if you want to take in some of your friends, or if you'd like to do a section, do it just a section at a time. It starts at Cambridge, Mass., ends in Quebec City. But some people do it, try to do it in the whole way. They've had a few people that have done the entire trip up the river and down the Chaudière to Quebec. And we had a person recently in 2017 who did that. But if you'd like to go over that route, this will tell you where to stop, tells you all the highlights along the way. There are numerous hiking trails where you can do short or long hikes as you wish. It has a listing of certain sections of the water route which you can do by canoe, and it tells you about how to do that there. But it should be interesting to a few people. If you'd like to learn history the right way, which is to actually go over the same route, do it. I think what I'd like to do now, if it's okay with you, is I'll enter questions for a few minutes until we kind of run out of gas, and then I'll stay here afterwards if you have more elaborate questions to ask. So how about some questions to begin with? Front row, easy for me to see. Go ahead.
Could you mentioned the diary of the priest. Could you talk about some of the other primary sources that are out there that were sort of records of the time about their experience?
There are many journals. We've discovered close to 29 journals. Now, these men were literate at the time, and they wrote down these journals. That we don't do that so much nowadays, but they did. And the first compilation of journals is contained in the book March to Quebec, which is done by Kenneth and Anna Roberts. That would be the best start because Arnold's journal, Dearborn's journal, Meggs's journal, and a lot of other journals are in there, and they describe it firsthand what they saw, what they did. So that's a good place. A second book, which is really worthwhile, is a more recent one by the name of Stephen Darley is the author, and he wrote Voices from a Wilderness Expedition. And that has a listing, a very useful listing, of all the participants and which companies they fought in, and some other information, which he was able to glean from pension funds and things of that nature. So those are good sources, and that will help you out.
Thank you.
Other questions? Question up there, yes.
There was a rough time for these people for 4 months. Unlike, as we all know, the Donner Pass in the west, one word would say the whole thing, cannibalism. Was there?
There is no indication in any of the journals that there was or any rumors. These were soldiers, and there's a difference. The people in the Donner Pass expedition were civilians, and they had no hope of going on. They were blocked and caught in one of the passes, and so it didn't occur. If you are interested in that, Kenneth Roberts also wrote a book called Boone Island, and some of you have probably read that. Read that one, and it will tell you a little bit about more. But on the expedition, no, there's none.
With all the game in the woods and wilderness and all the fish in the streams and lakes, I have a hard time understanding why they were having such a hard time with sustenance.
Well, I'm going to answer your question a little bit on the gross side. You can try to imagine 1,100 men marching through the woods and the noise that they're making, but in particular the smell that they're making. They did not pack toilet paper with them. But I would say that if you understand anything about, and I'm sure you do, about hunting deer, that deer, when they hear anything as much as a quarter of a mile off, will move off and away from them. One of the bad decisions that Washington made in putting this together is there's a tribe of Wabanaki Indians from the Cobbs County area that went all the way down there and offered their services to act as scouts and guides on the trip. Washington, because of his experience in Braddock's defeat and that whole expedition during the French and Indian Wars, hated Indians, and he had wanted nothing to do with them whatsoever. So they missed up a chance to have a group of Indians who could hunt to go in there and provide meat for the men as they were doing the trip. But generally speaking, is with that kind of noise, you can imagine, you ever went on a hunting expedition with 100 men, that altogether you can imagine there'll be very few deer around. Yes?
So it sounds like it was a colossal logistical failure. Who was responsible for the planning of this? As late as they
Washington, Arnold, and all of the leadership that was existing during the siege of Boston was the people responsible for that. You've got to remember something, though, that to be fair, there was no such thing as a topographical map at that time. How would they know what the elevation gain was, and for instance, going up the river and over into Canada? There was no information about that whatsoever. No one knew that. So it was a crapshoot and a good guess, and that was the best they could.
So the biggest mistake was ignoring the Native Americans.
That's a good start, yes. But there was a good reason for that. If you ever read stories of our history and our heritage at that time, Native Americans were pretty much hated. And unfortunately, but when they could have given both Arnold and Washington big help in that matter. But that's not uncommon. We have that same problem with our military in some cases today. Not as much, though. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Was this expedition secret all the way? Did the British not know that they were coming? Were there no spies?
It's been termed the secret expedition. Unfortunately, Arnold made some mistakes when he was in the wilderness, and he had previously made friends with certain merchants in Quebec City. And he was getting ready to see if they could help him to get into the city and to capture it. He sent letters to those merchants by an Indian guide, sent a second Indian at that point to try to contact General Montgomery to let him know what he was doing. Either one or the other were evidently intercepted by the British, and they knew he was coming. So, and the proof of that is that at the time they finally reached the St. Lawrence River, is that in front of where they were going to cross over to what's now was then called Wolf's Cove, there were two British frigates in the river right at that point. So they knew where that he was on his way. So they lost the element of surprise. Any expedition like that, and I don't pretend to be a military strategist at all, but any expedition like that is entirely based on surprise. They had no cannons, obviously, to knock the walls down, and they had to bank on the fact that they were going to be able to get in, sneak in, and overcome the garrison that was in there at that time. So, yes, the answer is they did have some notice that he was on his way. Yes? Yep. Yeah.
Oh, you said, or I heard somebody say, that this expedition, even though it failed, prevented the British from retaking Boston and so forth. How did that occur? If this expedition failed, how?
One of the things I like to wring people's necks on at times is you hear announcers always insert the word ill-famed trip or some such admonition like that. They did fail in capturing Quebec. The army after that retreated upriver because in the following spring an armada of British ships with no less than 10,000 regulars from European battles were rolling into Quebec City. Actually, if they had even captured Quebec City, they could not have withstood that. Remember that the Americans were at the very end of their line of supply, because they had to come up from Albany to Lake Champlain, down the Richelieu River, down the St. Lawrence River, and to Quebec. So It was a very, very tough military situation. They got knocked back. They had to retreat up the St. Lawrence in front of the troops that came in the following spring. This was a part of Burgoyne's army, and the theory here was that they were going to march in to down Lake Champlain to capture Albany and down the Hudson River and cut off the troublemakers in New England and then deal with them piecemeal. What happened was that when Arnold, who was the last American out of Canada, got onto Lake Champlain, he was able to assemble a naval force, which was very, very small ships, some of them only mounting one 24-pounder. And they were able to delay the British from coming down Lake Champlain during the fall of 1776. So, and of course the winter came on, the lake froze, so Burgoyne had to wait for the next year. The next year they came down again because they had an overwhelming British force. They were able to capture Fort Ticonderoga, as you know. They continued south and met a fairly large contingent of Americans who were now near the beginning of their supply line at a place called Saratoga. At Saratoga, Arnold and other generals and they had about 10 to 15,000 militia there at that time, were able to defeat the British. And as I said, I described that to you earlier. And as a result of that defeat at Saratoga, the French decided to throw in with us. And they gave us the military help we needed to win. Remember when at Yorktown, which was the final battle, who blocked the British from coming into Chesapeake Bay? Okay, that was the French. The French blocked Chesapeake Bay. The British couldn't get reinforcements. Then the British had to surrender. All that rose out of the win at Saratoga. And so that's probably the most decisive battle in American history for forming our country. So the answer is Arnold was able to delay the British from coming down to the point where they could get the forces necessary for them to win. Other question? Let me go into history here. Go ahead.
I just heard one story as an anecdote. Didn't Arnold on his way up the Kennebec stop and dine in Phippsburg with Captain John Parker or something like that? Is that an incident you know of?
Would you repeat that question, please?
Did Arnold dine on just when his voyage began up the Kennebec? Did he spend an evening in Phippsburg?
Oh, okay.
Dining with Captain John Parker?
The answer is probably no. I had that question asked of me earlier, and remember that one of the things about heroes is that George Washington slept here, that phenomenon. In his journal, that probably is the best information to answer your question. It makes no mention. He did stop at the Powder. J. Robbins, a very, very good historian, much better than I am, has been able to research and found that Arnold did make a quick stop when he was ascending the river on one of the sloops that we were talking about at the Powder Borough Courthouse, and he stopped there briefly, but not for dinner, but to pick up maps. But so I doubt whether that happened. But the best proof of answering that is not me. Read his journal.